Today we are sailing another type of ocean. I mean not this one, we are sailing the ocean of APIs. Well, API stands for Application Programming Interface. API will help services and softwares interact with each other. For example, when you pull weather data, or when you process any online payments, or when you fetch your favorite song, you are interacting with APIs. And if you want to develop an application, you need to call these APIs, and you have to code and know how to code to call and execute those APIs. But here's the question: can we chat instead of code with these APIs? I mean, similarly to how we chat with ChatGPT, can we chat and ask our requests to these APIs without any coding? Then let's change the way we navigate to API and let's go. Hello everyone, this is MG and welcome to another video. Well, if you have been developing applications or you know the process of development for applications, you might have heard and use API. For example, let's say I want to create a dashboard that can give me the online location of boats around me using GPS, and at the same time I can see the weather data, the live weather data, and the forecasted one for near future. Well, of course, I'm not generating GPS locations of boats data, and I'm not even generating weather data. So I need to sort of fetch them and call an API to get them from the source and then embed that in my own application. But I have to know how to code and interact with these APIs, and this is just a simple example. API interaction can be pretty complex. Now, in this video, we're going to see how we can use large language models similar to, for example, ChatGPT, that interact with GPT models to chat with these APIs. Let's say I can talk and say, I want to fetch weather data for this location for the current time. And that's it. No coding, no complex logic, and with just a conversation, the result will be back to me in both data and conversational manner. We're going to go through a simple development of Langchain for this scenario, but the purpose is just showing you the art of possibility and think about it how you can leverage this technique for your own internal API or external APIs and then develop your application in a much easier and faster manner. Then let's check it out. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so you will get notified for the next video. Thank you. Alright, this is gonna be pretty quick, easy to follow, but quite honest, pretty impressive and powerful solution that we're gonna walk through that together. So we have already talked a lot about different ways that you can leverage OpenAI models like GPT 3.5, GPT-4, that you can use it for text-based interactions, or you can use it to chat with your own data. And now we're going to talk about, beyond just going text, how we can use the capability of OpenAI models or these large language models to be able to call APIs. For giving you an example here, what I'm going to do, and by the way, I add the link of this notebook and the repo actually that contains this notebook to the Discord channel, so you can just get it from there. Clone it for your own environment, give it a try, and take it like a great starter to learn how you can leverage this technique, which is how we can use large language models to call our APIs. So let me give you an example. What I'm gonna do right now, as you can see, I want to interact with an API that can give me weather data. For example, I know there's an API that if I call it with a specific inputs, I can get the weather back. Let's say here I'm asking the weather for Toronto in Canada in degrees Celsius. So previously, without having this large language model and this technique, what I had to do first, I had to go through the documentation of this API, check it out, what is the URL, how can I code that URL and endpoint to get that weather data from Toronto. For example, I had to put the latitude and longitude of Toronto with some geospatial information about this location, put the date time that I want to have the weather data or the forecast of weather data, with all some other potential parameters in the code, and call this API to get the weather from Toronto back to my application here. But here, as you can see, I'm not doing that. I don't even care about the documentation of this API and how I need to call it to get the weather data, because now I can just chat with this API. and I'm gonna ask, what is the weather data right now in Toronto, Canada? And that's it. And the result gonna be back in a conversational manner as well. And by the way, I'm not just using here, let's say ChatGPT. As you can see, I'm saying right now. So the answer is not generated by a large language model. Large language model here, which is GPT-4, is getting used to actually figure out how to call this API, tell it to my computer that, hey, this is how you need to call this API, and then I'm gonna get the results back, and ChatGPT gonna explain it for me, right? So I'm interacting with the weather API, and the answer is not from GPT-4. So how am I going to do this? As you can see, I'm importing Langchain, and by the way, as they have indicated that in their documentations, and I actually got these codes and slightly modified them. So I got these codes from Langchain documentation too. They're mentioning that this is pretty evolving. So this is just the beginning of the development, but I think this is almost now good enough to let you start create your own scenario of interacting with your desired API with chat. So here, let's walk through the code. I'm importing necessary inputs and toolkits coming from Langchain, and then I'm gonna say that I wanna, of course, use a large language model to call my API. And here I'm gonna leverage my OpenAI key. I removed it. This is credential. You're gonna add yours. And here I'm gonna use GPT-4 because it has more token limit, so it's a safer choice. And then I'm gonna say that from Langchain, the toolkit that let me chat with APIs, this one, I wanna import it and say that, hey, I'm gonna talk or chat with my API and use large language model, which is GPT-4 here, I specified, to chat with my API. But what API? This is the API. Now here's a question. How GPT-4 would know what is the specific way of coding and calling this API? Because by the end of the day, there is a code to call my API, but it should generate that code and call it based on this chat input. So of course we need to give some instruction to this large language model, which is here GPT-4, that hey, if you want to call weather data, this is how you need to call the API. I mean, of course, the large language model won't call the API by itself, but it will tell my system that how you need to call the API, and it will call it on backend without me doing anything, and I'm just chatting here. So here's the trick. When you open this, if I can just simply let me print it here. There you go. Actually, I copied all of that in a Word file so we can see the rest. Let me open it for you. There you go. It seems like an exact instruction that how you need to interact with weather data. This is what we are giving to GPT-4, that hey, this is the URL that give weather data, and this is the documentation. It is saying that this endpoint accepts geographical coordinates. For example, here we need to convert Toronto to geographical coordinates, and of course each API has some parameters that you have to put inputs, and here all the parameters. So you can see in almost one page of documents, it is in a summarized manner, it is telling to GPT-4 what is this API and how how we can call this API. So with GPT-4 having this instruction in place, if I go back to the code, then I'm gonna ask what is the weather like in Toronto, and it knows how we typically call this API based on this instruction that I just showed you. So let me run this code. Okay, I ran the code once. I paused the video because I had to put the key back. I ran it, then I removed the key, and I resumed recording. And you can see that it just simply understood that, hey, I know that this is the base URL that I need to call, and you're giving me Toronto as your location, so here's a latitude and longitude, and you're asking me for the right now. That means I have to call the current weather. So these are the parameters that it understood how to call my API based on my chat input. And of course I said that I need to have the temperature in Celsius, and it added that in it knew actually in the instruction that there's a temperature unit called Celsius that can be a value for this parameter, and it got it from my chat input. And that's it. It got the results back from the API, and then it convert the results back to a conversational manner as well. So conversation input, conversation output. The current weather in Toronto in Canada is 16.8 degrees Celsius. Honestly, I don't know if it's true or not, how accurate the API is, but long story short, I didn't know anything about this API documentation, and I didn't even code this. So previously, before having this large language model based solution, I had to create this by myself. So I had to code to receive these parameters, add it there, and you never know what I'm gonna ask. So that parameters might change in future. That's why coding APIs can be complex. So this is the first way that you can interact with APIs using chat through a way called API chains. So there are two ways that, based on now Langchain documentation, they're referring to, that you can chat with your APIs. The first one is API chain. It says that this is the simplest one to start, and I think this is a good one to start because we want to learn actually, so you have more visibility of what's going on. But we might have more complex scenarios for calling an API. Sometimes we have to call multiple times, multiple APIs as an example. So the second way that actually we can leverage this technique by chatting with API is called agent. That's the second way, based on Langchain documentation, you can chat with your APIs. So let's go through an example for the second way. So for this scenario, it's for sort of more complex scenarios, so it is more powerful, but the idea is the same thing. I want to introduce the instruction of my API and let GPT-4 create the way that we call that API without me coding that actually. So what API are we gonna call? OpenAI. So what do I mean? I know it's a bit complex, but think about it. OpenAI by itself has an API. Right now, if you want to use ChatGPT, you can go to public ChatGPT, get login, and use the UI and start asking your question, right? But as you might know, ChatGPT, which is running by GPT 3.5, has its own API too. So OpenAI by itself is another service that you can call it through API. But again, I'm lazy or I'm smart. I don't want to go through documentation of how I need to code OpenAI API or how to call OpenAI models through their API in my codes. Then I'm gonna use this technique to chat and ask something, and then on backend it should figure out how to call the API, call it, get the results back for me. Okay. So the first thing I need to know, I need to tell this large language model that how we can interact with the API of OpenAI. So what's the instruction of OpenAI API? So here I'm getting this from the OpenAI repo. It's a YAML file. I downloaded it locally. Actually, let me quickly show you how does it look like. There you go. So you can see it's a YAML file. It's a pretty long one, quite honest, and it is giving me some description that how I can use this API. For example, you can see I have a specific parameters. What is the base URL? For example, how can I list the currently available models for non fine-tuned ones, right? So what I need to specify, well, I can say, hey, I want to get the engines or list engines. It's gonna give me the list of models that I cannot fine-tune them. You can see there are different type of parameters and values you can specify here and get the results back. Think about this OpenAI API just an API example. That can be your company API and the instruction of your company API YAML file, right? That's it. So regardless, this is just an example and pretty long one. So getting back to the code, I have this YAML file downloaded in my local machine. Now what I'm gonna do here, well, based on the Langchain code reference that I grabbed it from here, you saw that YAML file was pretty huge. So it is reducing that sort of instruction. So that big YAML file is now sort of a little bit reduced, and I actually printed that reduced version and I copied to a Word file to show you actually how it looked like. And here it is. Let me go all the way down. There you go. This is the reduced version. So again, it's telling that, hey, this is the base URL, this is the description, these are the parameters, value types you can add here. It's almost 2, 3, 4 pages, I would say, 3 to 4. How we can get, how we can post to this API. Again, think about this API of OpenAI as an example. That can be weather API, a Spotify API which Langchain documentation used, or your company API, whatever. Alright, so now you have this instruction in a reduced manner, and I'm gonna say that, well, I wanna interact with this API using chat. But of course, I need a large language model for having that capability. Again, I'm gonna use GPT-4. And now here's the place that I'm creating this. By the way, now what Langchain does on the back end, it will create a planner. So what is the planner? Planner will decide how many times, or what's the plan that I need to execute this input chat to an API call. You will see that it is calling API multiple times. So there's a planner that is actually planning how and when we need to interact and call that API. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna say that create this planner for this OpenAI documentation that I have, and this is what I'm gonna do. I'm just saying that, generate a short piece of advice. Well, this is a prompt I'm asking. If I wanted to ask this directly from OpenAI API, first I had to tell that, hey, which model of OpenAI I want to use to have this question sort of answered. Let's say DaVinci, GPT 3.5, and then I had to know what's going to be the parameter in that API endpoint to put this prompt inside. So now I don't need to know them. I'm just chatting, and this solution should know how to call this because I'm specifying the instruction. And that's it. I asked this, and look at that. Look at this chain of thoughts here. So the planner is saying that, hey, I think I know what I need to do. First, I need to figure out what's going to be the right API to generate the answer for this. So it figured out that, oh, actually, I have to first get the list of OpenAI models, get engines, to see which model I have to actually choose. And then you can see that it created the endpoint that it need to execute, and it got the results back. It got all OpenAI models back. Now it should decide which model we need to call to actually have this prompt answered. And moving down a little bit, and actually it's funny because sometimes it made a mistake in an API call, so it know how to fix it by itself. I think on backend Langchain is sending the error back to GPT-4, and it will revise itself and get the new API call back, so it will continue with the planner. And then that's it. After having, for example, the list of engines back, it chose, I think, DaVinci. I saw it somewhere. For example, now it says that now I need to know the correct parameter for the models, which is, I think, DaVinci was shown after. Let me scroll down. Yes, there you go. It got the ID because each model has an ID, and I think it needs to call the model from the ID. There you go. I chose DaVinci, and then I know this is the base URL, and I know the model is DaVinci. As you can see, this part was empty at the beginning, but it called GPT-4 multiple times to finally figure out how that API should get called. Then I know the prompt because the user gave it to me. Max token, well, I could specify in here, but it could sort of went with the default, I think. And you can see that for creating this endpoint, I had to code this part by myself, but it figured out after multiple calls that what's going to be the API endpoint. And if I scroll all the way down, that's it. It finally got the answer of this prompt back using a DaVinci model, but using this created URL. And here's my piece of advice for today, generated by DaVinci model. So that's it. It was just a quick example of telling you that how you can use large language models plus here Langchain development to call your APIs. Here we interacted with Weather Data API and OpenAI API to interact with them, get their services, fetch your results and data back without you knowing the documentation of those APIs, without you needed to actually code to call those APIs. And sometimes it is just simple as one call, but sometimes you need to go through a planner, like which is the agent-based or second-based solution by Langchain, to even call your model, large language model, multiple times to figure out how this API need to get called to answer your request, which is just a chat. And I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and I always read them all. Sometimes I do apologize that I don't get a chance to answer all of them, but quite honest, I promise you that doesn't mean I won't read them. I read them, any single comment, and definitely do my best to implement them and do hear all your suggestions. Hope you enjoyed the video, and that's all. Not great ideas make success. Only success makes success. So be successful in creating even a small success and use it for making the next bigger success. And don't forget, cooperation will give you power, not confrontation. And lastly, the world is small, so you will see people again. That's why you have to show respect every single moment. Dream big, my friends, believe in yourself, and take action. Till next video, take care.